Hi, everybody. My name is Eric Hines. I'm curator of film at Museum of the Moving Image. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for hanging in there. If you've been waiting, a little bit of a delayed start. If you had trouble getting in there, we apologize for any issues with the link, but we're working on that. We hope to be welcoming more of you attendees over the next few minutes. So I'll start with the introductions and just say, again, thank you for joining the Reverse Shot Happy Hour. We're back on Friday. We had a Friday version of it right before Halloween a few weeks ago, and we're back here this week. And I think we're actually moving back to Wednesdays next week. We'll get this settled and solid coming forward. But the way that the calendar is shaping up for the next bit of time is that Fridays are a lot of holidays. So we're going to go back to Wednesday and move it back to 6 p.m. So we're going to stick with midweek as a hump day happy hour, but then also start a little bit late in case those of you who are back working full time can join us a little bit more likely to do so at 6 p.m. So we'll send messages about this. You don't have to remember that now, but we'll be shifting back to Wednesdays and at 6 p.m. starting next week. This we're many months into the Reverse Shot Happy Hour, and we appreciate those who find us every single week, whether you're doing so live or whether you're joining us via YouTube. I also want to quickly just mention our ongoing Kickstarter campaign for the museum, which is helping us to get through these months where we still can't get back into the building. There are plans to get back in there. There are hopes to get back in there. We're also sort of dealing with the ongoing situation in terms of the pandemic, which is volatile to say the least. But we have very great plans for what we're going to do back in that building. But in the meantime, we are online, and we will remain online even when we're back in the building. And just as a little teaser in terms of our Kickstarter campaign, there's a lot of things that we're giving away and making available in terms of each one of our departments. And Reverse Shot itself is chipping in that for a certain Kickstarter donation, you can get the 3 Reverse Shot books that were published by the museum several years ago: the Agnes Varda book, Steven Spielberg book, and the Martin Scorsese book. All fantastic volumes collecting the writing, the Reverse Shots done over the years on those 3 filmmakers. And so please, if you don't have those books yet, they're not actually available otherwise right now because our store is not open. So please find us that way. We appreciate any help that you can offer us. And finally, I think a good number of you are finally in this room. Apologies again for your delayed entry, but now we're ready to start the Reverse Shot Happy Hour proper with our hosts, the founders and editors of Reverse Shot, Michael Koresky and Jeff Reichert, and longtime contributor and filmmaker Farihah Zaman.
I did the thing where I talked before I got in. I've been doing this for how many months now? Hi, Eric.
Hi, Eric. Sorry about that extra long, but it's a good song at least. We got a lot of pulp.
Yeah, I was fine with a double header on that
extra
one.
Pulp, if you will.
Yeah.
And with that, I'll see you guys in a bit.
See you in a bit.
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to change the name of this week from Happy Endings to Crappy Beginnings. Sorry, everybody.
You can't have both. I think that's actually true of a couple of the films that people wanted to talk about today. Sometimes the crappy beginning makes the happy ending even more worthwhile.
Yes, things can only go uphill from here.
Yeah.
How's the end of your week? Happy?
I'm feeling a little bit better than I did a couple days ago. I don't know how everyone else is feeling. This has been a real emotional roller coaster of a year, of a month, of a week. So it still feels like the culmination of a lot of emotions. I'm glad that we're doing this week on Friday instead of Wednesday. I think I was kind of back in some depth of despair on Wednesday, and now I'm feeling a little more elated and optimistic. How about you?
Yeah, I would say about the same. It's still a nervous making time, but it feels better by the day, I think.
Oh, I think grief is not a straight line. I'm like expunging in this totally unpredictable emotional way, but I think, that's what we were discussing and trying to think of an appropriate theme for this week. It's hard to take our minds completely off of the election cycle that shockingly is still sort of continuing. It's hard to be completely certain about the future, but also feels appropriate to celebrate in some way. So maybe it's happy endings.
I think that was one of the
Is
reasons
the- is
why
the-
we had this topic.
Yeah, maybe that's the appropriate way to talk about it. And that's in part because we have two really great guests today. We really wanted to think about unpacking that term. It's such a sort of overused phrase and sort of a given, like what does a happy ending actually look like? Is it in fact happy? Sometimes you would have preferred a more tart ending at times. So we're thinking about all of the ways in which we're sometimes disappointed and sometimes gratified and satisfied by an easier resolution to film. So both of our guests are longtime reverse shot contributors and regulars of the show. But I want to highlight a couple of things for each of them because they also just had really great work published. So Chloe Lizotte and Ashley Clark.
Come on in.
Come on in.
Unveil yourselves.
Chloe just recently had a reverse shot column about the recently departed Quibi. Rest in peace.
Rest in peace.
All right, Quibi.
It's probably longer than the content was intended to be for
we
each
will
little
be
Quibi movie.
we'll
It's a
be
deep
talking about
dive on a
Quibi
short
longer than
platform. And Ash had, I think, two big things to highlight this week. One is a New York Times article about Steve McQueen and the Small Axe series that just is going up. And Ash, you actually have a whole new regular column with my alma mater, Field of Vision, which has been really amazing to see such in-depth work from you on a regular basis. I was very excited about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, congrats on all that writing. It's been a delight. I'm always happy to see when really great writers are published, whether with us or elsewhere. It's very encouraging and exciting for this often confusing line of work, this field of vision. So congrats to both of you, and I highly encourage people to read this writing, which Jeff has just posted in the chat window.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you.
Do we want to kind of start maybe with a little bit about your piece, Chloe? Because though this is not the topic for the day, one of the things we're talking about is rather maybe bittersweet endings to long, drawn-out narratives.
Sure, yeah, and that's certainly what this piece was about. So I wrote kind of, I guess broadly speaking, it's kind of a Quibi post-mortem for reverse shot that's kind of gone through several phases. I start by talking about a drive-in screening in California where a Quibi series was presented as a seamless full-length movie, which is exactly the opposite of what Quibi is supposed to be. And so the idea for the piece came from that event. And while we were working on it, lots of dramatic things happened with Quibi, culminating in it finally ending the day that we basically locked the final version of the piece. So it's been kind of a wild ride to write this, but it's also not exclusively about Quibi. I kind of wanted to use it as an occasion to think about kind of like what filmmakers are doing interesting work that's actually engaged with, like, how do you tell interesting stories and like device textures or virtual spaces. So that can be a direct satire of Quibi, like a parody app, which the performance art project by comedian Nick Koresky did as his character, Craig Healy. He made this app called Swippy, which is like just a total kind of vanity project, needs to be seen to be believed, sort of thing. Yeah, I would highly recommend checking out the link. Maybe we can drop it in the chat. And then talking about kind of filmmakers in the art house space, like Eduardo Williams, Zia Anger, Terrence Nance, and James N. Keenitz Wilkins. So it's a wild ride, inspired by a complicated ending.
Yeah, I think it's good to point out that even the most coherent essay goes through a lot of, revises and drafts. And it's really funny that in this case, the ultimate demise of Quibi happened before you were finished. So it changed somewhat the lead and the opening of the piece, but it didn't change the overall thrust, which is, as you say, important to remind people. And why I do think it functions well in the theme of the week is like you're providing good alternatives, right? You're not. I mean, how many pieces? It's a dime a dozen to read pieces making fun of Quibi. We've been making fun of Quibi for months. What you do is you say, like, there's interesting, shorter form, interactive content that's out there. You just have to actually know where to look for it.
Yeah, totally. And like places like Quibi are kind of like an easy target. Like there was that really great expose in Vulture in July that's kind of the definitive, like, let's look at the executive level dysfunction in this organization. But then, like, how many times do you really want to read about kind of like all the trashy cash grab series on it? Instead, like, I think we all wanted to kind of pull back and look at the like environment that makes a place like Quibi possible, and like what it can enable or support or work against around it in art house spheres.
When was Quibi founded in the first place?
The app launched in March or April. It was like very early pandemic. I can't remember when.
They'd have been thinking, well, we're Quid's in here,
right?
In terms of timing. But it's interesting to track it. Obviously, I've been working in theatrical programming, which very quickly turned non-theatrical, and
right.
You're suddenly thrown into the deep end where you're second guessing audience habits at home, which is pertinent to what we're doing now. And when we put on a screening, do we put it on at 7 p.m. and say, well, if you don't turn up, then bad luck? And you quickly realize that actually people don't work like that at home. So it was really interesting that they probably thought with the not to be overly cynical, but with the pandemic, they probably thought, wow, this is a great time for us. And yet, well, maybe it was more to do with the Golden Arm situation or whatever that.
Yeah, I mean, right. It's like, I could go into what that show is, but people should really look it up. It's like, basically it's an anthology series about like, they were going to go through folk tales set in every single state. For some reason, they decided to start with Michigan, which apparently doesn't have very many interesting urban legends. They started with this bizarre Golden Arm like story. You can read more about that on the internet if that appeals to you viewers out there. But Quibi it was designed for people who were like commuting or needed to kill time waiting in line. But when the pandemic hit, I think Katzenberg and Whitman kind of blamed the pandemic for their failure, which doesn't make a lot of sense because it is a time when people are kind of looking to like fill their time with a series, whatever it is, good or bad, mindless or not. But yeah, it was kind of a confusing, like kind of like last ditch, like who can we blame for the bigger failures in this project? Sort of bad timing thing, I think.
And I think we'd love to talk about Quibi the whole time, though. I was thinking.
Would we?
Well, some of us would maybe like to hear that because there's so much Schadenfreude that goes into the discussion of that company. But when you brought up Golden Arm, I started thinking about the kind of comeuppance, the Alfred Hitchcock Presents-esque, Twilight Zone-esque comeuppance of morally dubious characters, and there used to be a lot of that in short form, Tales from the Crypt, the whole EC Comics tradition, and that actually got me thinking. And this is where I'm going to do my magical segue powers. That actually of the first selection from Ash, who about on today's topic. You had decided upon a very interesting film for a happy ending, which kind of explodes the idea of what a happy ending could be. And I'm very intrigued, and I'm going to pass it over to you.
Yeah. A film that's been on my mind a lot this year, and since I saw it, was Uncut Gems by the Safdie brothers, which I first saw at TIFF last year. And spoiler alert, obviously, I'm going to discuss the ending. If you don't want to know what happens, cover your ears now. But it ends with the execution of its leading character, played by Adam Sandler, an inveterate gambler, jewelry store owner, and total scumbag who pushes his luck all throughout the film and eventually ostensibly runs out of luck at the end. So it might seem like a strange choice for a happy ending, but as I thought about the film and as I kind of de-stressed after watching it and kind of unclenched, it kind of struck me that this man who's ultimately irredeemable, alienates everybody around him, mistreats his wife, played by Idina or Adele Dazim, should I say, in one of the great scenes where he decides that he's been cheating on her, but he decides he wants to be back in her life, and he bears his heart and soul for her, and she just laughs at him, and it's a very satisfying moment. He's essentially irredeemable character, and yet the moment before he dies, he's just won very, very big on a bet. And it struck me that this man is dying at his moment of greatest happiness. Like, his life is never, ever going to get any better than that moment. And what a dream to be able to perish at the moment when your endorphin levels are at their highest. We know from his behavior and from the Safdie's filmography leading up to this that this man's not going to suddenly turn the corner and become a good Samaritan. He's going to just chase the next high. So there's a real kind of logic to that, which, and also he's not a sympathetic character. It's not like you'd want a sequel. You wouldn't want to spend 2 more hours in this guy's company. And there's something about the film that does map onto this year in many ways. That could, I could develop a more fleshed out thesis and write something about it. But that idea of being trapped in front of somebody who's ranting and raving and scheming and double dealing while you're kind of essentially powerless to stop it feels very relevant and apt. The idea of poor Arno, played by Eric Bogosian, and his henchmen trapped in the safety doors, watching all of this unfold, is also very resonant, as we've all been essentially trapped at home in various different stages of lockdown. And the film gives you some kind of release. Obviously, the film begins kind of a tracking shot traveling through Howard's arse and ends going through a hole in his brain. And it just kind of has this beautiful logic to it. And I think it's a very satisfying ending. It has to end that way. And the film's kindest gesture is to execute its main character at his moment of greatest happiness in delight. And I think that's kind of sweet.
Well, I think it allows you to feel 2 kinds of satisfaction that normally would be at odds with one another. One, if you have an ambivalent feeling about this character, on one hand, you get to feel the satisfaction of his comeuppance, which it's funny that we've, in a way immediately gone to that as a kind of happy ending, right? Like it's a moral correction that we value for this person, but he also gets to be happy. He also, on some basic animal level, is given his, greatest desire. Getting both in one moment is really special.
And the fact that it comes after such an intense experience.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we all use a lot of overused critical terms. It was a roller coaster. It was an emotional, gauntlet. And I made it on the other side. But the Uncut Gems genuinely runs you ragged. And
genuinely?
Genuinely. I felt sick after watching that film, the 3 times that I've seen it. And by the time he finds that final exhilaration, it actually is rad. It's kind of like the Lost City of Z, but at a much faster pace. It's elevated to this higher plane. And it's beautiful. It's really beautiful. And yes, he doesn't really necessarily deserve any better or worse.
And then to map it onto the idea of how we're all feeling this week, it's not, there's no sense of joy or happiness, but it's more sense of a mild relief of being so close to that particular void, while not forgetting that all the structural things that have enabled this situation remain very much in place, and whatever comes next is not certain. But it just it feels more like a relief. It feels more like a moment of some kind of catharsis, which feels resonant this week as well.
That's a great point. Feeling close to the void is a really good way of putting it. I don't feel like I'm quite there yet, but I feel like we have avoided something potentially a lot worse. And I think that's one of the reasons why we alighted upon this theme. We were really trying to figure out how we're feeling right now. How do we, because we took last week off from happy hour. We were all feeling the stress from the election. It was just, obviously, who would want to talk about movies right now anyway? So coming up with a topic for this week, we were having a hard time defining how that feels, what that is. And that weird, that hope that we feel, that optimism that we feel is still so mixed with the trauma of what we've been through that happy endings felt very aspirational.
Well, or like the baseline for happy moves depending on where you're at. So I wouldn't even say I'm in a place of hope or optimism, but what Ash is describing is like when you're at the bottom of a pit, but you make it to the top, you're like, this is incredible, right? Like that's what relief is. It's not that there's optimism or higher to go. It's just that you're not at a deficit or something. And I wonder if that's maybe why I also, in responding to the theme or thinking about the theme this week, immediately thought about like revenge movies. And that like, it's a kind of, it's a sick and twisted expression of joy. I don't know if the relief quality applies, which I very much agree with Ash is like the best way to describe what that release is. It's not joy, but it's relief. But in this case, you know, I was thinking of Let the Right One In, which is a movie that I think even among horror circles, I don't know if it's like considered cliche to like now, but I still do. I rewatched it recently during my Halloween viewing, and it has like, I'm very hard on movie gore. Like, has it been earned? Does it really deserve this kind of release? And it's one of the most violent, horror movie endings taken on against school bullies, right? Which means you're just watching children be massacred. And I completely think of it as a happy ending. It's like complex and grotesque, but they're starting at such a deficit that simply like getting to a point of some kind of relief or freedom is incredibly satisfying.
Is the Pyrrhic victory of revenge films will be one of the most hotly debated movie topics until we have our last film, which may have happened already. But I think you think of the Tarantino cycle of revenge films. I mean, it's just there are films that pretend to be complex. It's like a kitten with with a ball of yarn. Like it's pretending to really engage with this, though often I think they're just paying lip service to complicated revenge conclusions. But that's a really good example of it, because it just brings out such a complex reaction in the viewer, and it's different for everybody.
I don't think it's right that I feel happy about it.
Right.
I felt disgusted with myself that I was like rooting for the murder of children in a pool. Another spoiler, sorry.
There's a lot of
I think it's very human also. Sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
What does it say about us that the movies that we're talking about in the happy ending show are so filled with death and murder at the end?
Well, we can move on from that, because I think that Chloe's first choice is not necessarily violent, but it is another film that gives you a lot of release after a lot of trauma.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a movie about murder or revenge, but it's about a lot of intense, difficult subjects. I chose Clean, the Olivier Assayas movie, which for those of you, if anyone hasn't seen it, it follows Maggie Cheung, who is amazing, unbelievable in this movie. We'll all agree. She's a rock musician, and her boyfriend, played by the front man of this band Gallon Drunk, they're actually kind of good, but he overdoses and passes away, and she's also addicted to drugs and goes to jail for possession and comes out. And the most of the movie follows her kind of working through trying to get clean and trying to build a relationship with her young son, who's in the care of his grandparents on her boyfriend's side. So that, and they're played by Nick Nolte and Martha Henry. And so most of the movie is kind of like just following Maggie Cheung's character through her day-to-day life, trying to like figure out if she should get a normal job, trying to navigate the way that the music industry is changing, trying to navigate kind of working through her addiction, rehabilitating herself, and also trying to kind of like communicate with her son in these short sort of bursts. Sorry, there's like an ambulance outside. There you go. But after all of this, there's kind of this like, she has sort of a once in a lifetime chance to try and go to San Francisco to record a song, which is sort of something that she's given up on throughout most of the film. And she's trying to figure out how to make it work because it's also the same weekend that she's caring for her son. And Nick Nolte like trusts her enough to kind of take care of him. And so the ending, this is definitely a very spoiler heavy show. I guess everyone should have been aware of this. But the ending is yeah, the ending is basically she considers like sneaking her son on the plane with her to go to San Francisco to kind of like have it all. And she goes to the hotel where Nick Nolte is staying, and she has him run in to try and get his passport. And Nick Nolte walks by as soon as she gets there, and he kind of figures out what's going on, and they have a conversation that's very like they kind of recognize all that they've been through up to this point. It's this moment of like trust where he's kind of like, I understand that you're trying to make this work. I'm gonna take care of Ben, I think is her son's name, for the weekend. You can go, we'll connect afterwards. And it's like on paper, it should be this kind of very like melodramatic, overly sentimental moment, but it's like, it's so well played. And so like the movie is just like, I don't know. I mean, it's like when you describe it, it really does have the form of like a melodrama, but it really just like, it's so kind of like lived in and authentic in the way that it's done and kind of muted, but also just like very honest and kind of leaning into what those feelings are without like movifying them, I guess, if that makes sense. But the real ending of the film is her kind of performing this song and in the studio in San Francisco. And it's just like, it's not about whether the song is performed well or not. It's just her kind of like having this very emotional kind of release in front of the microphone. And Dave Roback from Mazzy Star is recording it, and he doesn't even say like there's no like cathartic, like, oh, that was so great. It's kind of like, let's take a break for now. And then she leaves the room and they talk about it, and they're kind of like, oh, that was great, but are you feeling tired? Are you feeling jet lagged? And then, but I don't know. I mean, it's just kind of like, it's like, it's hard to talk about just because it's so like, I may cry thinking about it. But yeah, I mean, just like the way that kind of like Osias directs these emotional currents is really astounding to me whenever I go back to this movie.
Yeah, I remember her, doesn't she emerge out onto a sunny balcony?
Yeah, that's the final shot. It's kind of like she leaves because after they compliment her performance, she looks into this cup of coffee and starts crying, and then kind of gathers herself and goes out, and the camera pans up, and it's sort of this like wide San Francisco vista, and it's sort of like, it's not really a resolution. It's not like a guarantee, like, oh, everything's going to be perfect and great now. It's just kind of like, here's the world. Here's a chance to like start fresh, sort of, you know? It's not like, yeah, it's not cliched in that way, but it is that kind of like really powerful ending.
Those are the best kinds, when there's no sense that this is over. It doesn't wrap it up in a neat bow. Sorry, Farihah.
Well, I was gonna say, it's like, these are, you know, the kinds of happy endings we're talking about. Their power lies in completely opposite things. Like if the power of a revenge movie happy ending is basically wish fulfillment, like a depiction of something that's so stylized or dramatized, or, you know, it's something that you don't necessarily want in reality, and that's cathartic, then the kind of resonance of what you're describing is like, it's nowhere in the middle. It's completely recognizable as achievable. And I think part of, you know, getting older is each year what you imagined a happy ending would look like, or even just moments of happiness would look like, are always like a little bit worse than you thought, or a little bit, you know, reality is always much more mixed. And so like, it's funny how something that reflects that is actually much more resonant for you than something that feels neater.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, he's actually kind of a master at making exactly that sort of ending. Because when you're describing how clean makes you feel, and I agree very much with you about the feeling of like, you know, things quietly falling into place. Life will continue. This is a moment that will be part of a continuum of moments. It's important, but maybe not that important in certain ways. We don't know. I feel the same way at the end of Summer Hours, when you've seen that house kind of, you know, be completely evacuated of all the objects that were in the place, and then filled up again with this new generation of life. And then all of a sudden Assayas pulls back and plays the incredible string band, you know, music from the 70s, music of his generation, sort of watching this changeover happen. It is the world continuing before our eyes. And that's like, what is more amazing than that?
Right. And that's so much of his work, like even beyond the level of the characters, but like so rooted in the characters, like how Summer Hours is about like globalization, and Clean is about like the music industry changing in that mid-aughts way, kind of like pre-Spotify situation, and like even, you know, nonfiction about like the literary industry and kind of technology. And I mean, just like you could go on with all of them, but like, yeah, always trying to like locate the people in the midst of that, and kind of, yeah, understanding that like this is something that's sort of just the inevitability of like how time moves and how people move and how things happen, without like making it like a dramatic statement about what it all means, if that makes sense.
Well, if in Summer Hours everybody had gotten exactly what they wanted with no challenge or struggle, the challenge and struggle is what makes those like smaller and more bittersweet joys feel hard won and lasting.
Definitely.
I was thinking about the term happy ending and how we're sort of conditioned. We've been conditioned for years to expect the Hollywood happy ending, right? I think it's a term that we've come to understand is really connected to a tradition. So, you know, if you're watching, it's very rare, right, to watch a classical Hollywood film outside of some, you know, noirs, where, you know, it just has the most despairing ending. Outside of melodrama noir, right? I mean, like Imitation of Life, Double Indemnity, sure. But, you know, I was thinking a lot about Magnificent Ambersons, because it's one of my favorite films, and because it's famous for having the tacked on Hollywood happy ending.
Right.
And I was thinking about how, even though the studio imposed, and just not just imposed, like made without Orson Welles even being there, made an ending and put a happy ending onto this incredibly despairing story, which is about comeuppance. The word that is used most often in that film is comeuppance.
Yeah,
which is
that was going to be the initial source of the happy ending. It's like a much darker, more cynical view of the world. Is that what makes you happy? Is like people getting theirs.
Right, and then the you know, they tack on this redemptive final scene, which is, you know, hilariously abrupt and famously inconsequential in a way, and you're supposed to leave feeling like some sort of lesson has been learned, which is, you know, kind of is both the point and goes against the point in a morality story. But it's also a great example of how even a work of such genius retains its genius. It's still a masterpiece despite this tacked on ending. And I love this idea of films that function still the same way despite that, where the darkness is so complete that despite this tacked on happy ending, it's a complete work of art. I think that's the ultimate example. There are some other ones.
I think of the Searchers in this respect. Like everything that happens after John Wayne has recovered his niece, to me, just it feels like it's in a completely different movie, because everything that has happened prior to that, the weight of that material, it's so dark and so despairing. Like in Ambersons, like it just feels, the ending that's put on can't overcome what's happened before.
There's a film called Claudine, directed by John Barry from 1974, which has just been released on Criterion. And that has, it's about James Earl Jones plays a garbage collector who falls in love with a mother of six, played by Diane Carroll, who is subsisting the best she can on welfare. And it's a really beautiful film. And they go through the emotional roller coaster, Michael's favorite phrase. And I happened to watch this film in June, as you can imagine, in the aftermath of George Floyd and the protests happening and all of this being very forefront in my mind. And resonant with what you were talking about, Ambersons. The ending, the eldest son is an activist, and he's at a protest, and the protest gets crashed by the police, and it happens to be Claudine and Roop is James L. Jones' character, happens to be their wedding day. Now, on the one hand, the film kind of ends in a screwball fashion, and it's kind of funny, but the very final shot is the family all running, the kid being arrested in a police wagon, and the family kind of running after they've just been married to join him in the police wagon. So the very final shot is this family being carted away, the happily married couple in a police wagon. And I just became completely overwhelmed by this image of their only happiness existing within this completely oppressive system, and I just couldn't stop crying. And then the very final image which is underneath the end credits, is them all kind of like very 70s sitcom style, jauntily kind of walking down the road together, which suggests that yeah, fine, they've been released. But to have those two images juxtaposed, I found really powerful, and one of the greatest instances of that kind of ambiguity in the context with which you watch a film entirely determining how it's viewed. Maybe if I wasn't in that headspace in June, but you know, I'm always thinking about systemic racism and oppressive systems, which you know is not the most fun headspace to be in. But I thought that symbolism was really powerful. But then I discussed the film with Robert Townsend for the Criterion disc. It's his favorite film, and he didn't interpret it that way at all. He was like, "Oh no, I thought it was just kind of a fun and there's a quirky twist, and then they all get out at the end." And it was just so interesting how the context can shape your perception of a film.
Well, yeah. Well, another film that I had mentioned to you all when we were discussing this conversation as being it's my favorite happy ending of all time, which is The Color Purple. It's a film that I've seen many times since I was very little. It's a film that just I almost know by heart at this point, and it very famously has this utter catharsis of an ending. Right? You've been watching this woman, Celie, played by Whoopi Goldberg. You've been watching her very sad life over the course of many decades. I actually don't think I want to spoil it. Well, she's been separated from her sister by an abusive husband who married her when she was a child. She was raped by her father. Her children were taken away. She doesn't even know if her children are alive until she discovers these letters have been hidden from her for years. Everything, about her life is traumatic and horrible. And she is allowed this final moment of pure catharsis, right? And so it's a scene that always makes me cry. I anticipate it with a mix of anticipation, glee, and terror, because I don't know how I'm going to respond. But the reason that it works so well, if you believe it works well, because it is, again, that we're talking about Steven Spielberg, hotly debated in terms of endings, I should say. It's because what you've been going through for the past 2.5 hours is so extreme. I don't think that a truly happy, cathartic ending really functions without going into the darkness. And again, debatable whether he goes too far in one direction or the other. A lot of people thought that it was a sugarcoating of Alice Walker's book, because he was using Hollywood, a traditional kind of white supremacist Hollywood grammar to tell this story. But it's also a very purely humanist film in many ways. But I actually watch that film sometimes actually to just get the charge, to get the emotional charge from it, because it makes me feel alive. Like the empathy and humanity of it make me feel alive. But you have to get through all the darkness to get there. So happy endings are often, they emerge from the dark.
So I feel like I'm the only person today admitting my baser, you can just push this button and give me this feeling thing. But I have a very specific trigger. It's like a catharsis trigger in movie endings. And it doesn't matter. I feel like what you're describing, Michael, is speaking to the story aspect of filmmaking and viewing, and what has been built up emotionally through the content and the writing. But I think there's some kinds of visuals, moments, shorthand that are designed to push your buttons, right? And sometimes they're effective. Mine is the moment in movies where like a parent finally sees their child's talent or value or something, like think School of Rock, think Sister Act 2 Back in the Habit, where the parents arrive just in time to see the big solo and they make this face. And every single time, it doesn't matter what has happened in the story up to this point. It doesn't even necessarily matter if I'm particularly attached to those characters, even though I think both of those are pretty good movies. I just immediately have this emotional reaction, and like that's a happy ending to me.
Yeah, so a parent recognizing their child's skills, or the opposite of Dead Poet Society, which is of course is one of the worst.
But it's the visual. It's not that it happens in the story. It's seeing that face. It's seeing the look, like they're on stage, or I hear their words, or it's the like quiet acceptance. I don't know. I'm definitely revealing something about my upbringing, but
yeah, it is very telling.
So I guess it's also very personal what stays with you, even though from a narrative standpoint, you haven't gone through the darkness. There was nothing necessarily earned. It just like did it.
Somebody in the chat mentioned the end of Before Sunset, the baby, you're gonna miss that plane, which is another hits my buttons.
Yeah.
I just like
I said
I love it so much.
I love those films so much, but it's interesting. I was thinking about all three of the Before films, the Linklater trilogy. Each one has an ambiguously happy ending. He managed to pull it off, the three of them managed to pull it off 3 times. Each one of those films has an ending where you're like, oh, I feel so great, it's all going to work out, but is it? I don't know. What really happened? All 3 of them, and that's pretty remarkable, actually. And I've seen them many, many, many times.
What are other movies that you wish had a happy ending? Like we've talked about movies where like where the happy ending feels false to you or forced, but what are movies where it actually feels like the dour ending feels forced?
I have answers, but I'm gonna wait.
Well, just a quick one is and I think this perhaps Spike Lee felt this way when he did the ending for Jungle Fever. Which is one of my
really interesting example.
All time, all time weirdest endings ever. So you've gone through it for like 2 hours and 15 minutes or whatever. There's absolutely everything in this film. Interracial romance that goes horribly wrong, police violence, patricide, crack addiction, you name it. This film gives it to you. And then just when you think the film is reaching a kind of a gently upbeat conclusion, Wesley Snipes is reunited with his long-suffering wife. They enjoy a night of gentle lovemaking. The daughter comes in the morning to wake them up, and the music starts to swell, and you think, oh, that was tough, but we've earned this. Wesley Snipes leaves the house, and then out of nowhere,
You're gonna describe it.
Out of nowhere, a young woman just runs up to him, grabs him, and says something like, "Yo, daddy, I'll suck your dick for $1," or something like that. And then he kind of looks really shocked, and then suddenly the camera just is from miles away, and it must be on a swing or something, and it just swings in from miles away, and Wesley Snipes just screams, "No!" And then it just ends on a freeze frame on his face. And then it just ends. And I've watched this film many, many times now, 5, 6, 7, whatever. And I can't pass it. And that's what I love about it. I don't know what he was doing. It must have felt right. But to go back to your point, it was like, maybe he just felt the upbeat ending somehow wasn't right. Mm-hmm. So he needed to do something else to underline that, things aren't actually okay.
Right.
Much like we were talking about at the start, this is not a moment of joy and happiness, or actually where, the systems that oppress us are still firmly in place. But the way he chose to do it is a source of endless joy and amusement for me.
Regardless of whether that ending works or not, whatever the hell that means, it's an unforgettable conclusion. I watched that film with my parents. which is strange in general, on video, rented on video in 1991, right when it came out. And that ending came on the screen and my parents looked at each other and said, what was that? And they rewound it. And they rewound it and watched it again to make sure that they had seen what they had seen. And then they just kind of shrugged and walked away.
That is such a good memory.
Yeah.
It was a great memory, actually.
Just hearing you talk about it made my chest tighten. It did feel, it was very I don't know. It transcends labels like good or bad. I don't know how to place it on that spectrum.
I
just know that it was like such a gut punch that I still remember the feeling of it.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's something about it that like takes you just out of the movie and just like you're just so aware of like having a body and like being able to react to something like that too, that maybe like I don't know, like maybe that helps and like disrupt the lull of the film or something, but it is a pretty, I would say, spectacular ending.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
To add to the question of a movie that I always want to have a happy ending. I know this is strange because it takes the entire point of the film away, but I always imagine, what if after Carrie goes up on stage at the prom, the bucket of blood doesn't, the bucket of blood that Nancy Allen has put up there for her, what if it malfunctions? It doesn't happen. It falls over. They look, they laugh. Carrie's the most popular girl in school. Movie's over. I always want that to happen. Because
and then she becomes Matilda.
Right. She finds it's funny.
I think that speaks to how well the movie sets that up, that even though you know what happens is the true ending, you still deeply want a different outcome for that person.
I care about her.
And now you have acknowledged a raw animal happy desire.
Well, why not to make it all about Carrie, but why I care about Carrie White so much is because she could have harnessed that power for good if she had a better parent. And I think we all know that. And better friends. She had some bad friends. Weren't really friends. I actually wanted to mention another thing I'm sorry if I was jumping in. Please cut me off, somebody. But in terms of a bad, false, happy, it's a bad, false, happy ending. Ugh. Park Chan-wook's
double negative.
Park Chan-wook's Lady Vengeance,
uh-huh.
which I think is a loathsome film. I despise it. I actually like Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, and I think Old Boy is, it's interesting enough, I guess. Who cares? But Lady Vengeance has one of the worst stabs at like a false happy ending that I've ever seen, where after you are made to watch horrific things. You're seeing like the murders of children, parents forced to watch the murders of their own children, and it leads to this big revenge ending where they take revenge on the person who killed it. And then after all that, Lady Vengeance herself walks out into the snow and a single tear falls on her face. Was it all worth it? I don't know. Revenge is so complicated, guys. I hated that movie. That's a good example of like trying to do like a complicated happy ending, but making it really banal.
Well, speaking of complicated happy endings, I mean, we've talked a million times about one particular ending, which is the ending of AI, which I think at the time when it came out, many folks looked at the ending of that film with Haley Joel Osment with his mother on the ship as if it was some sort of like very happy, very cliched sort of Hollywood ending. And I remember leaving the theater thinking, oh my God, this robot is going to exist into eternity on the ship alone with these other robots. And what could be more depressing than that?
I also, well, whatever. We've talked about, how many times have we talked about AI? But it's anybody who watches AI a second time realizes that it's the most depressing ending ever, including Eric Hines.
And now the most depressing ending has come.
I feel like I had to appear just then, Michael, because I'm as I've spoken of before, I was the audience who misread that ending the first time, and then the second time, and every subsequent time have been absolutely devastated by that ending. But misread the language of it as being happy the first time through.
Genuinely perplexing how one can actually think a movie in which a child is curled up next to his dead mother on a bed is a happy ending. genuinely perplexing.
And I know it's a block in terms of us actually being understand each other as human beings, that you'll still never understand how I could have been that person. And yet I keep bringing it up so that you can remind me.
I also wanted to say Luke mentioned It's a Wonderful Life in the column, and that was another film that I had thought about today, actually. When I think of Color Purple and It's a Wonderful Life in tandem as films that I watch at certain times every year to give myself a certain kind of kick. And that's also a film that's just so utterly, completely dark, and people who don't watch it very often or haven't seen it in a long time don't realize just how grim that film is. And that catharsis is so incredibly earned. It's a beautiful, beautiful movie.
I have a real formative experience around Breakfast at Tiffany's, which like inexplicably is a young girl's slumber party movie. Even though it's about
it is in retrospect a really weird move that it is
yeah,
that slot.
it's about like people who need to do sex work. There's nothing wrong with doing sex work, but they don't seem like it's their choice or that happy about it, and how like gritty and hard it is to live in New York City, and like love just can't bloom in that environment. And I remember watching it as a child and being like, cute, romantic, nice cat or whatever, and then revisiting as a teenager and being like, what is this movie about? And then I read the very short Truman Capote story in which, sorry, spoiler, they do not get together because Paul is pretty clearly a gay man, and the nature of, like, on one hand it's so much better because the nature of their relationship is so much more interesting. It like really went beyond this initial, you know, how the Hollywood read of like boy and girl meet, and it like enriched my life to discover that the happy ending was not right at all. And now every time I see it, which is some, you know, I've watched it a handful of times as an adult, I'm like, this is not what I just can't look at that ending the same way.
It's also in the soaking, pouring rain, which is always complicated. Because of Madison County.
And they like crush the cat between them, which also kind of bothered me. But separate issue. Animal abuse.
I just want to jump in and say that in terms of the ending of It's a Wonderful Life, the Saturday Night Live alternate ending or lost ending for It's a Wonderful Life is one of the great skits where Mr. Potter gets murdered by the entire town.
Can I just quickly say, can I just jump in and say, I recommend viewers, if you're interested in a really bananas alternate ending, look up on YouTube the version of the Crying Game ending that the funders insisted that Neil Jordan shoot. In case the original ending didn't get much play. And of course, the twist in the Crying Game is often misrepresented as the ending, even though that it only happens halfway through the film. I'm talking about the actual ending, and it's there on YouTube, and it's a real shocker.
Don't you feel like, and you don't really see how it would end pre-credits on that clip. Do you feel like that would have been a freeze frame on what they're off? It feels like a freeze frame, like a smile.
And a wink, as a cheeky wink at the camera as well. Yeah.
I do remember that It's a Wonderful Life skit on SNL, Eric, and it is kind of the perfect example of the catharsis you think you want, and then you see it in action and you realize how ridiculous.
Yeah, that's a clip I've like recommended to friends before, just as like remembering it as one of my all-time favorite SNL clips, and it's just awful to watch with other people. Just in general, it's like you're laughing and then it's like, oh, we're watching this now for the next 5 minutes.
They did it with To Live and Die in LA as well. That's also on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
That also has an alternate happy ending, which is equally just weird and crazy to behold.
Michael, you're talking about that it should have a freeze frame. Makes me think like there's a whole other conversation we could be having in terms of freeze frame endings and whether or not they work and when they work or if they ever do.
Is that something that you can do in Zoom? Can we give everyone a freeze frame toast?
I can, but we should do that. We should definitely freeze. I can think of a really funny freeze frame ending that my husband and I talk about all the time, which I don't think is often talked about as a bad ending, but it's such a bad ending to a very acclaimed film, which was The Lives of Others, that German.
Oh yeah, people love that when it came out.
It's not a particularly good movie, but it has this freeze frame happy ending that is just hysterical. Like I just want people to go back and watch this again.
Doesn't Life
Takes
is
place
Beautiful
a full
also
time-
end with a freeze frame?
Oh God, I blocked that.
Pretty
sounds
sure.
right.
It does. I think it does.
I'm pretty
yeah.
sure.
Oh,
I don't know why I think of those films together, but I feel like they share a similar aesthetic.
I hear that.
yeah.
I do.
Who
Thank
did
you,
freeze
Chloe.
frame on at the end of Life is Beautiful?
I like The Gambler has a good
Yeah.
freeze frame ending.
The Gambler.
Ah,
Never seen it. Never seen it.
Well, just remember, just because it's frozen doesn't mean it's happy.
No, it's actually really not in that situation.
I have a dog, which she's just like staring up at me. She knows that the ending is nigh.
They always know, they feel it.
Well, I just want to throw in, since I wasn't part of it before, that my favorite happy ending, which is also a complicated one, is The Last Temptation of Christ.
Ah,
oh, yeah.
that's there you go. That's everything.
It's sort of everything. It sort of is the ending of endings when it comes to complicated happy endings.
Yeah, no, it's one of the greats, one of the very great. Obviously, there are great endings we haven't talked about today because they're not all necessarily happy ones.
Sure.
That's a complicated one, right?
But it is happy, right? It's
want a happy ending? I don't know.
right. Well, this is the happy ending that saves us all at the expense of the man's life. What's that?
John Dielman a happy ending?
John Dillman. That's a good one.
100% in the
Okay.
catharsis mode. Again, I feel like I sound like a sociopath, but let's be honest. We all sometimes crave the release of tension, and there's a reason why Jean Dielman is a classic.
Since we started a little bit late today,
Yeah.
Did we want to do a quick round robin? Did anyone have any endings they want to quickly mention that they didn't get to talk about on the?
I mean, Beau Travail, I think, is one of my favorite happy endings of all time, even though it ends with the main character lying on his bed about to shoot himself and then cuts to an imagined space of him finally finding relief in a dance hall. I mean, that is the best. I quiver with anticipation for that ending every time.
Yeah.
The Rhythm of the Night. Yeah, there you go.
Oh yeah. The
Yeah.
music is an incredible fade. I mean, I feel like you've unintentionally revealed my favorite happy ending in Jean Dielman. And I could just go on a long rant about that and the frustration of being a non-man on a day-to-day basis. But I had a slightly lighter, shouldn't have been a happy ending, which is The Witches, which came up on an episode recently, the episode about witches. But the literary source material, Roald Dahl's book, The Witches, is set in the real world in which there are real consequences. And sometimes if your whiny ass got turned into a mouse, that's how you have to live, even with the shortened lifespan that entails. And they have to I appreciated that they try to find some kind of, life in that way. And in the movie, everybody gets turned back. It's utterly ludicrous. It's like so clearly tacked on. The movie is done. You have felt all the emotions you need to feel. And then all of a sudden, the old witch's assistant was secretly a good witch. And she's running around town, zapping those mice back into little boys. It does not feel right.
No.
Back in the catharsis mode, I think Sexy Beast is a film that has a great ending that feels very earned. After just it's very, I started with Uncut Gems, end with Sexy Beast, but it has in the character of Ben Kingsley's Don Logan. I'm just going to come out and say it, a very just Trumpian figure. And I've definitely been thinking about that film as we've come up to this moment and what the end of Trump, such as it is right now, and how it will play out, what that would feel like. And it certainly, there is that aspect of just total, you just want to see this man really fall. And Sexy Beast offers that in a very cathartic way. And I recommend it if people haven't seen it.
And then has that nice symbolic closer.
The lovely little touch at the end, yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, I'd just throw in Minnie and Moskowitz before we leave. I guess we're getting another glimpse into me wanting to feel every single emotion before having just the ultimate concluding ending that's a little hopeful. But yeah, this one is much more of a happy ending than clean for sure. But yeah, also just like I love a good romance. When we're talking about like endings that we didn't like for some reason, one that always comes to mind is like, I always want them to be a couple in Norma Ray at the end. I know that's like not how the movie works, but like I always get frustrated. I'm just like, why can't they team up and just like, you know, do labor organizing? But I don't know. So that always gets to me. And Minnie Moskowitz is such a beautiful movie. And yeah.
Cassavetes is great for these because he wants to end on an upswing, but they're always upswings that are based in that particular moment. You don't get the sense that things are going to be okay or resolved. He just wants to leave you on some sort of optimistic note, and then you know very well that just happens to be where the curtain falls.
Right, definitely.
Cool. Max Carpenter mentioned A New Leaf. That's a really, really good.
Oh yeah, that is a good one.
A really weird happy
ending. A really different direction, I would say. The happy ending that I always am fascinated by is Rocky IV.
Oh man, yeah.
Now we're talking.
Because not
everyone.
The first Rocky, you know, he loses, but it's a moral victory. It's a second one, it's a tie, and it's the third he gets to win. By the fourth, none of that is enough. He has to vanquish the Soviet Union, and not only does he have to vanquish the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev has to stand up and give him a standing ovation. The actual leader of Russia has to applaud for Rocky.
It's true.
It's hard to outdo Rocky IV for a happy ending.
And even though it's hard to outdo your mention of Rocky IV, I'm going to outdo it by saying I want to mention an actual happy ending in a movie from this year that is like the different definition of happy ending, but also functions as a happy ending, which is Tsai Ming Liang's Days, everybody, because Li Kangsheng gets a happy endy.
That's true.
And
it's literal and figurative.
That is true.
And it's also
the
most cathartic, happy-ish thing that happens in a Tsai Ming Liang movie. So congratulations.
Yeah. Very tender.
We got there.
Yeah, I was waiting.
Yeah, one of the best handies in cinema. To which I include Moonlight and Fear.
True that.
Oh,
Moonlight and what?
Fear. I stand by it.
Want a quick shout out, our reverse shotters in the audience: Badati Chowdhury, Caden Mark Gardner, James Wham, Max Carpenter, Ryan Swen, Devika Girish, and Susanna Gruder. Thanks for joining us.
That's so nice to see
everybody.
Thanks everyone. To happy endings.
Cheers, everyone.
Happy endings.
Happy endings.
Cheers.
Of all kinds.
Freeze frame.